The story begins long before the courtroom battles, before the appeals, before the nation found itself watching a former president stand trial. It begins in the final days of the 2016 election, when a single payment, small by the scale of American politics, was quietly transferred behind the scenes. A payment of $130,000. A decision made in secrecy, under pressure, with an election hanging in the balance. And no one involved could have predicted that one payment would ignite a legal and political conflict that would outlast administrations, reshape constitutional debate, and return again and again to the center of American life. In late October of 2016, with national polls tightening and the political world in chaos, Donald Trump's attorney Michael Cohen arranged the payment to Stormy Daniels. Prosecutors later insisted it was not merely a personal payout. It was an effort to suppress a story that could damage Trump's campaign at a critical moment. Daniels claimed she had an encounter with Trump years earlier. Trump denied it. But at the heart of the prosecution's case was never the alleged encounter. It was the concealment of the payment within business records, disguised as routine legal fees. Years passed. The country changed presidents, policies shifted, and political tensions grew sharper. And then, in 2018, Cohen publicly turned against Trump, setting into motion a series of investigations that eventually led prosecutors in Manhattan to build a criminal case. For a long time, many believed the case would not go anywhere. But in 2023, charges were filed. And by early 2024, the world was preparing to witness something unprecedented, the criminal trial of a former president. Inside the Manhattan criminal courthouse, the atmosphere during the trial was unlike anything seen before. Reporters lined the hallways from morning until night. Security details stood shoulder to shoulder. Each witness entering the courtroom felt like a moment pulled directly from history. Michael Cohen testified in painstaking detail, recounting conversations, payments, invoices, phone calls. Prosecutors placed documents side by side, showing how reimbursements were allegedly disguised as legal retainers. Defense attorneys countered by tearing into Cohen's credibility, calling him a liar with a motive to betray his former employer. The weeks of testimony built to a tense climax. On a warm day in May 2024, the jurors filed back into the courtroom, silent, carrying the weight of history. When the four persons stood and delivered the verdict, guilty on all 34 felony counts, there was no outburst, no shout, just a breathless stillness that echoed around the world. For the first time ever, a former president had been convicted of a crime. Outside, New York erupted. News helicopters circled overhead. Protesters and supporters clashed on the streets. Broadcasters spoke into microphones with a tone that mixed astonishment with disbelief. Trump left the courthouse declaring the trial a witch hunt, a political attack, a disgrace to the justice system. But the legal system had spoken, and the case moved forward. Then came the next moment of historic tension: sentencing. As January 20th, 2025 approached, Trump was preparing to take the presidency again. For the judge Juan Merchan, the situation was unlike any sentencing hearing in American legal history. Trump was convicted, yet scheduled to assume the highest office in the land. Sentencing him could create a constitutional crisis. Not sentencing him would draw accusations of favoritism. And so the judge made a decision that rippled across the country. He issued an unconditional discharge. Trump would receive no jail time, no fines, no restrictions. The conviction, however, remained. This choice didn't end the story. It only pushed it into a new chapter, because Trump was not willing to live with a conviction sitting on his record. In October 2025, his legal team unleashed an explosive 111-page appeal. It challenged everything: the rulings, the evidence, the judge's impartiality, the prosecution's motives, the instructions given to jurors. And in the middle of those arguments lay something even more powerful, a new legal precedent that had emerged from the nation's highest court. In July 2024, the U.S. Supreme Court had dramatically expanded the doctrine of presidential immunity. They declared that former presidents are immune from criminal prosecution for official acts taken while in office. This was not a narrow ruling, it was sweeping, transformative, and Trump's attorneys seized it with both hands. They argued that parts of the evidence used in the hush money trial were connected to Trump's role as president, press statements, strategic decisions, communications involving White House staff. If even a portion of that was considered official conduct, then the Manhattan conviction was built partly on unconstitutional evidence. Their next move was bold. They returned to federal court, asking again for the case to be transferred out of New York's state system. Previously, Judge Alvin Hellerstein had denied the request, stating the hush money actions were personal. But Trump's team argued that under the new Supreme Court ruling, the case had to be reconsidered. And on November 6, 2025, the legal earthquake struck. A three-judge panel from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit ruled that Judge Hellerstein must reopen the case. They determined that he had not fully considered how the Supreme Court's immunity decision affected the use of evidence in the trial. They vacated his earlier denials. They sent the issue back to him, and with that one ruling, the conviction, once thought settled, was thrust back into uncertainty. Suddenly, every aspect of the case, from the payment to the trial to the evidence, was under new scrutiny. Trump's legal team celebrated, calling it vindication, proof that the trial was unfair. Prosecutors fired back, stating that the payment had nothing to do with presidential duties and that the conviction would stand. Legal scholars debated on television whether the ruling would protect or endanger future presidents. Supporters flooded social media declaring Trump's innocence. Critics argued he was escaping consequences by exploiting constitutional gray areas. In the quiet corners of legal offices across New York and Washington, attorneys began preparing for a federal showdown unlike any other. They combed through transcripts, examined communication logs, reviewed statements made during the presidency, and prepared arguments on the boundaries of presidential power. Documents that once seemed straightforward now required constitutional analysis. Evidence once seen as admissible now depended on the complex question, was Trump acting as a private citizen or as the President of the United States? Meanwhile, in the Oval Office, Trump addressed crowds, rallies, and cameras with a familiar tone of defiance. He insisted the prosecution was political. He pointed to the appeals court victory as proof that he had been targeted, and millions of Americans believed him. Millions of others believed the opposite. The country was divided not just politically, but legally, philosophically, emotionally. As the months moved toward the end of 2025, the case stood balanced on a knife's edge. Judge Hellerstein would soon determine whether the hush money conviction belonged in federal court. If he said yes, the case could be reopened, reevaluated, or even thrown out. If he said no, the conviction would remain. But Trump's legal team was prepared to appeal further. Behind the scenes, the legal teams understood what was at stake. Not just one man's conviction, not just the question of whether business records had been falsified. The case now stood at the intersection of presidential power, constitutional structure, and political identity. It carried the weight of history, and no matter how Judge Hellerstein ruled, the decision would echo far beyond the courtroom. The hush money case had grown into something no one foresaw, a test of the limits of presidential immunity, the authority of state courts over federal officers, and the question of whether a sitting or former president could be held accountable the same way any other citizen would be. And as 2025 closed, the story was still unfolding. The courtroom doors would open again, arguments would be made again, and the nation once again would watch as United States versus Trump moved into its next chapter, one that could redefine not just the case, but the presidency itself. A story that began with a payment in 2016 had become a battle for the meaning of justice in America, and the ending was still unwritten. Thanks for watching, and make sure to subscribe to my channel for more updates like this.